Hi, everyone. Welcome. Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Jen Miroff, and I'm the chair of the Legislative Action Committee for the League of Women Voters of Massachusetts. And on behalf of the League of Massachusetts, Executive Director Celia Candeman and Board Presidents Marie Gauthier and Courtney Rao Rogers, welcome to One Person, One Vote, the LWV campaign to abolish the Electoral College. We're pleased to host Dan Lashansky, Chair of the Palm Beach County District of Floridians for National Popular Vote. This program is being recorded and the recording and slides will be shared and posted tomorrow. Let's review our community norms. Be kind, be respectful, assume positive intent, bring your full self and limit distractions, use the chat feature to ask questions during the Q&A section of the program, and message staff with any private comments or concerns. So abolishing the Electoral College is one of the League's 5 priorities within the Women Defend Democracy campaign, where we will work to provide democracy education and election administration support, restore and defend voting rights protections, abolish the Electoral College, protect democracy organizations and institutions, and fight for reproductive freedoms. So Dan will be briefing us on National Popular Vote and then take your questions via the chat. So if you can please stay muted and hold your questions until that Q&A section of the program, that would be great. So Dan Lashansky is the chair of the Palm Beach County District of Floridians for National Popular Vote, as I mentioned, and a member of its statewide steering committee. Dan had a 23-year career in the Nassau County Police Department in New York State, beginning as a police officer and retiring as a deputy chief. Dan commanded a precinct with almost 200 officers and 100 civilian employees. During his law enforcement career, Dan earned a law degree from St. John's University School of Law. Before moving to Florida, he was the chair of the Civil Rights Committee of the Long Island office of the Anti-Defamation League. So welcome and thank you for joining us, Dan.
Thank you. Okay. So I am going to do share screen right away to make sure it's all working properly. And that should be good. Jen, you can see the first slide?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Now I just need to move everybody. Great. Okay, so I am going to talk about National Popular Vote and how that's part of the One Person, One Vote initiative and how eventually that will lead to abolishing the Electoral College. But I'm not talking about abolishing the Electoral College with National Popular Vote, and you'll see that in a moment. So let us get started. When we talk about National Popular Vote, the first question or the first statement I want to make is, under the current presidential election system, whether your vote matters depends on where you live. And we'll get to that as we go through the program. So believe it or not, there are 519,000 elected officials in the United States. Yep, 519,000. And every one of them, except the president and vice president, are elected based on how many popular votes they receive. And why do we do it differently for president and vice president? I'm going to do a really quick history with you. We go back to 1787, the Constitutional Convention. The Revolutionary War wasn't over until 1783. Under the Articles of Confederation, it wasn't working well, so they decided to get together and fix the Articles of Confederation. Eventually, or within 30 days, they decided it couldn't be fixed, so they're going to create a brand new constitution. Now, at that point in the world, every country was run by dictators, monarchs, dynasties, conquerors. The United States was truly an experiment. It would be the first time that the head of state would be elected. But think about our 13 colonies, although they were all states in the United States, they really were like separate countries sort of working together. So they needed a system that would work well for all 13 of these states. They came up with a whole bunch of ways to pick the president. Congress should choose the president, governors should choose the president, state legislatures should choose the president, Some people even thought maybe the president should be chosen directly by the people. None of those were really grasped. So as a compromise, the Electoral College was established. It was the least objectionable of several bad choices. It was not decided on because it's a wonderful solution. It truly was a compromise. And today, every state has electors. How many electors do they get? It's equal to the number of members of Congress from each state. So if you looked at the number of members of the House and the 2 members of the Senate from each state, that's the equivalent of how many electors you get. Across the country, there are 538 electors. So somebody needs 270 electoral votes to win. That's half plus 1. So that's the magic number, 270. Most of us know it. We just lived through it. That's what they need. So no matter how many individual votes candidate receives, 270 is the magic number. And because of that, twice in the last 7 elections, the second place candidate for popular vote has won the presidency. Fewer popular votes, more electoral votes. That's why those 2 candidates won. And when you look, it's happened 3 other times in our history. So 5 out of 47 presidents, more than 10%, were elected, even though they were in effect the second place candidates for the popular vote. Think about this for a second. The original plan of the founding fathers was to give a certain number of electoral votes to each state, and then every individual vote in that state for a candidate would be counted towards that candidate's total nationwide amount. The idea that winner take all would exist, all or nothing, that wasn't an idea. The idea was that every candidate would keep their votes. Let me go back again to the early days, 1796. Thomas Jefferson is running against John Adams. Jefferson loses by 3 electoral votes. And if you look at the map, you'll see that in 3 states, Jefferson received all the electoral votes except 1 in each of those states. Jefferson quickly realizes, along with a bunch of other people, if they had a system where if you get the most electoral votes, you get them all, Jefferson would have won. And so that's the system that the political parties began to morph to. And it's what we have today in 48 states. The candidate in a state who wins the most votes receives all the votes. In effect, it is what I just said, an all or nothing system. So no longer would every vote for every candidate count towards each candidate's nationwide total. Instead, one candidate from the state would get all of that state's votes. And the biggest problem with that is that it creates swing states and spectator states. I'm sure we all know swing states are states that could go red or blue. They're evenly divided. Spectator states, on the other hand, are predictable. We know even before the election that there are more of one party or the other in the state. The problem, the villain, isn't as much the Electoral College as the way political parties have gamed the system, starting way back to this all or nothing system that's created swing states. In presidential elections, winners in more than half the states are announced even before all votes are officially counted. So the reason for that is that most states are spectator states. They have a majority of voters that are predictably red or blue. So the real election takes place in the swing states. And generally, there are about 12 swing states. Those are the people that determine the president. If you look at the 2020 election, there were 12 swing states. And 96% of all the campaign visits by a candidate took place in just those 12 states. You can actually see the numbers. Candidates don't waste their time in states they can't win or in states they can't lose. They spend their time in swing states. In fact, in 2020, there were 33 states that never saw one candidate during the election cycle. because they couldn't win or they couldn't lose. That was 2020. There were fewer and fewer swing states each election. In 2024, some people originally said there would be 9 swing states, but the real pundits knew there were 3 critical swing states and a max of 7 swing states. That was 2024, where 94% of all the campaign visits took place in those 7 states. It was 33 states in 2020 that didn't receive a candidate's visit. It was 32 states in 2024 that did not receive a candidate's visit. There are fewer and fewer swing states, fewer and fewer states that matter in each election. And the result of that is that 12% or less of the population are deciding who the president's going to be. Go back to what I started with, whether your vote matters for president depends on where you live and whether you live in a swing state. So you should be duly annoyed right now. Some of you knew this already, some of you didn't, but saying it usually makes people anxious. So I have a little slide that'll just kind of relax you, take a deep breath, watch the fish swim around, because it doesn't get better. So it's bad enough that just a handful of swing states determine the president. But in recent elections, swing states themselves are so closely split that it takes less than usually 0.5%. So let's take a look at 2024 election. In 2024, Trump won because 0.7%, 0.7% of voters in 3 states, 115,000 people, voted for Trump instead of Harris. That was the margin by which he won. He won by 2.3 million votes nationwide. But the reason he won the Electoral College starts with that 115,000. And if you look at 2020, Biden won because of just 0.1%. If 21,500 voters in those 3 states combined had voted for Trump instead of Biden, despite the fact that Biden had 7 million more votes nationwide, Trump would have won that 2020 election. That's how close it was, 0.1%. And if you look at 2016, Trump won by 0.3% of voters in 3 states. By the way, the same 3 states that mattered in 2024, 0.3%. And this is not just about the last 3 elections. If we go back to 2004, in 2004 election, George Bush beat John Kerry for the election because 0.1% of the voters in just Ohio, 60,000 voters in Ohio, voted for Bush instead of Kerry. Had they voted for Kerry, despite the fact that Bush won by 3 million votes nationwide, had they voted for Kerry, Kerry would have won Ohio, the Electoral College, and the presidency. Pretty bizarre. And that's why now we need puppies. And then we're going to get really into it, because when you look at the weight of electoral votes by state, it gets even more frustrating. When you look to the left, for Vermont, Wyoming, that's how many people are represented by one elector. So in Vermont, there's about 200,000 people represented by one elector. And when you go all the way to the right, Texas, Florida, New York, California, approximately 800,000 people are represented by one elector. So despite the fact that electors in Vermont represent 1/4 the number of people in the larger states, they have the same power, the same vote as the elector who represents 4 times that amount. So when we look at one person, one vote, and we think, okay, every vote for president should count, every vote should count equally, they would if we really had a system of one person, one vote. But with the Electoral College, we don't, because of state-initiated all or nothing laws, which created swing states, and because of the current allocation of electors. So where do we go from here? A lot of people say we should just abolish the Electoral College. It's antiquated, it's confusing, it wasn't a good system to begin with, and campaigning only takes place in a few states. Well, to abolish the Electoral College would require a constitutional amendment, and that requires 2/3 vote of both chambers of Congress and ratification by 3/4 of the states. Not really likely. There is a second way, and that is to have a constitutional convention, just as they did in 1787, when they threw out what was then the Constitution and started over. And that doesn't sound like a really good idea. There are no ground rules to a constitutional convention. But there is another way, a third way, an easier way, a constitutional way. The Constitution leaves it to the states to create their own system for awarding electors. Over the years, electors have been based within a state on congressional districts. 2 states still use congressional districts, Maine and Nebraska. Electoral districts set up just for voting for the president. Legislatures have chosen electors, and in some places, like today, entire states. In fact, Massachusetts has the honor of being the state that has changed their system the most amount of times. There's been 11 different systems in Massachusetts. 11 times the Massachusetts legislature has changed the manner in which they will award electors. Whatever we do, the key is going to be moving away from this all or nothing system. And for me and for my group, national popular vote is the answer. It is an interstate compact approved by states that choose to participate. Those states agree to change how they award their electoral votes. And it will guarantee the presidency to the candidate who receives the most votes in all 50 states and the District of Columbia combined. It is a nonpartisan solution. So some of the features of the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact are, number one, it respects states' rights. There is no constitutional amendment required. It is in the Constitution that every state has the right to award their electors as they choose. In the end, with National Popular Vote, candidates will end up campaigning in every state because every vote of every person in every state counts and counts equally. As a result, candidates will end up moving away from the extremes because the same reason, every vote counts. And lastly, National Popular Vote is supported by Democrats, Republicans, and more than, 65% of the public. So, great idea, wishful thinking. Well, you may not be aware, but the National Popular Vote's already been enacted into law by 17 states in the District of Columbia. That's 209 electoral votes. The most recent one was Maine in April of 2024. From here, we need just 61 more electoral votes to reach 270, and then the National Popular Vote will go into effect. Let me just show you quickly how it works or the effect of it. So on this map, you see the current number of electors per state. That doesn't change. But those purple states are the ones that have already opted in for a total of 209 electoral votes. When there are enough states to equal 270, they are a voting bloc. If they all vote the same and they've all agreed to vote the same, then whoever they vote for will win. They will not vote based on party. They will vote based on who wins the most individual votes across the country. Who wins the popular vote? And then 270 electoral votes are cast for that person. It changes what we're used to, because what we're used to is a system that the political parties have morphed into something that doesn't look anything like what the founding fathers envisioned. They never envisioned 51 separate elections, where not only is it weighted by state, but one winner in each state steals the votes of the other person. And I use steals purposely to emphasize the point. What the founding fathers wanted was a system where the vote for every candidate counted towards their nationwide total, not just towards their state totals. So hopefully at this point, you're interested and you say, what can I do? Well, if you go to the website, nationalpopularvote.com, that is a nationwide organization. It's a wonderful site full of great information. And the first thing you can do on the very first page is click a button and send an email to your legislators telling them, I'm in favor of national popular vote and you should be too. Now, Massachusetts already passed national popular vote, but there are always discussions about repealing it, whether it's in Massachusetts or other states. And as time goes by, people get complacent. So let your legislators know that it's still foremost in your mind and you're still in favor of it, and they should be too. Second thing you can do is schedule a speaker. Just as I've come to you on Zoom to speak tonight, we can send speakers to you live or on Zoom, whatever your group, civic association, social organization, political association, will basically come anywhere and explain national popular vote. And last, tell your friends and neighbors. Tell them about national popular vote. Tell them what you heard today. Our goal is to build an army of supporters across the country so that as we take in 1, 2, 3 more states, people understand that this is truly nonpartisan and this is what the founding fathers intended. So with that, I'm going to open this up to questions, some which may be in the chat, and others you're welcome to raise your hands, and either Jen or I guess will call on you. So I'm going to stop my share.
Thank you, Dan. That was awesome.
Great.
We learned so much just in this brief overview that you've given us. I actually had one question before we kick it off to the
Sure.
chat and for people to raise hands, which is, could you provide a little more detail about the expansion of the national popular vote? You identified 3. We just need 3 more states. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, we probably need 4 or 5 more states. So we need 61 more electoral votes, depending on which states come in. And I will tell you that when national popular vote kicked off, I don't know what it is now, 15, 17 years ago, this was a bipartisan issue. It went into states and Republicans, Democrats, independents voted for it because everybody saw that, okay, this is a fair system. This will bring in better candidates, and it doesn't advantage one party or the other. It advantages the better candidates. Starting in 2016, that changed, where some people think it's a Democratic leaning operation. What's interesting is the lead lobbyist for national popular vote is a very loyal and emphatic member of the Federalist Society. And his attitude is, yeah, I'm a Republican, but this is great. I'll match our issues against the Democratic issues because this is a fair system. What's fair about campaigning in swing states to special interest groups where 0.1 or 0.3% of the population chooses the president? So our goal in national popular vote is to bring in more states. And there's a couple of ways to do that. One is with constitutional amendments, citizen initiatives. Another is to begin to support candidates who are running for office, state legislature, who will be making these decisions but to support them based on whether or not they support national popular vote. So there's a lot of lobbying going on. There's a lot of grassroots support. There's a lot of keeping legislators informed from us, which is thank you for your support, or let's talk, maybe you'll change and begin to support this. So a lot of things are happening.
Amazing. Okay, we have some great questions in the chat. Do you know what state, from Nancy Morgan, what states are close to passing this law? Is anyone close?
There are a number of states that are close, but you never know. So for instance, Michigan had a trifecta from the last election where they had a Democratic House, Democratic Senate, Democratic governor, and we thought they would come on board, but their trifecta was unusual or it wasn't expected. And so they had a lot of other bills. In the end, they never brought it to the floor for a vote. And then in the last election in 2024, they lost the trifecta. And so now we don't know what's going to happen. There are a number of states that have been gerrymandered, like North Carolina. They elect a Democratic governor, but they have a supermajority Republican legislature. So some people think that's a good state for a constitutional amendment because the people are evenly split. And we know that liberal and moderate Republicans, based on our polling, are in favor of national popular vote. And so along with Democrats who are in favor around 80% national popular vote, that's a good state. Wisconsin has the same issue. They elect a Democratic governor, but they have a majority legislature Republican. So we're trying to figure out which are the best states. Those are a couple. Arizona, I think I mentioned, is another one.
Great.
So yeah, we just have to wait and see.
And Margaret Sam asks, could you discuss the opt-in and opt-out component of NPVIC?
Yep, great. So states pass a law, the legislature passes the law, the governor signs the law, and it's a law. And that commits that state to this interstate compact. They can get out of it the same way. They can pass a law to get themselves out of national popular vote if it goes through the legislature and the governor signs it, or maybe the legislature overrides a veto of the governor. The only restriction is they can't get out from July 20th to January 20th. Basically, they can't get out 6 months before Inauguration Day. And by the way, if Inauguration Day is changed on the calendar to December 15th, it doesn't change the law. The law is written as six months before Inauguration Day. So the same bill has been passed now for 15 years. It is a 2-page bill, front and back of a sheet of paper. It's 888 words, and it doesn't change. There are no amendments. Pass it. It's an interstate compact. That's it. And it's written in such a way that it has survived things that you would think, oh, we'll have to rewrite that law. No, it's really well drafted. So that's the opt-out provision. There was one state that tried to opt out, and that's Colorado in 2020. What happened is the legislature passed it. Then in the election, the legislature changed. They didn't have enough to pass a repeal, so they put it up to a constitutional amendment. They thought the people would repeal it, and it failed, so it remains the law of Colorado. And just to let you know, an interstate compact, if you're not familiar, it's an agreement among states to do certain things. So for instance, there are states that share electric grids. There are states, if you've ever driven in one state and gotten a ticket and you try to get a renewal in another state and they know about it, that's because there's an interstate compact. If you have to pay child support in one state, they can garnish your wages in another state, interstate compact. And probably the most famous interstate compact is the Powerball. Mm-hmm. How is it that you can buy a ticket in one state, but you can get paid off with money that came from multiple states? It's an interstate compact. So.
Lynn Brodsky asks, is big money in politics fighting this? It would not surprise me at all if this is the case.
You know, big money is not yet. It's not.
Okay.
out there, but I will say that there is a concerted effort to put up all the negatives about national popular vote. Most of them are pretty comical because although they sound good, they just don't hold up. The most popular one is if we had national popular vote, then the cities would choose the president because everybody lives in the city. Candidates will only campaign in the cities. It's not true. If you looked at the cities, you'd find that the 100 largest cities have 20% of the population. And even though cities are generally more democratic, they're not only democratic. They're like 60-40, 55-45. So it's not like everybody in the cities is going to vote one way or the other. But only 20% of the country live in cities. So if you only campaign in cities, you missed out on 80% of the voters. By the way, 20% of people live in rural areas. 60% live in suburbs and exurbs. And if you want to see how people would campaign when every vote counts, all you have to do is look at how they campaign in swing states. They don't just campaign in the cities and swing states. They campaign in the same percentage that that geographic area has. So if 15% of that state's geographic area is farmland or rural area, about 15% of the campaign events in swing states are in rural areas. And if 18% are in cities, about 18% of campaign events are in cities. And by the way, that's how governors campaign too. So in a state, the governor campaigns for every vote. And they campaign in the same way. They don't just campaign in cities. So that's one of those talking points that we hear all the time. And it's just kind of silly. So.
Does NPV, Liz Brandt asks, so NPV can work with ranked choice voting. Now Maine has both.
NPV was designed to work with ranked choice voting. In fact, the gentleman that started ranked choice voting was on the committee that created the NPV Interstate Compact and created it keeping in mind that we can go to ranked choice voting. So what NPV says is the candidates vote, the final vote is what we use for the nationwide total. So in ranked choice voting, if it comes down to 3 candidates or 4 candidates, so let's say we know who the winning candidate is, but there are still 4 candidates in the race, and we know this one got 10%, this one got 20%, this one got 30%, this one got 50%, then those 4 amounts would go as part of the nationwide total. I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but yeah, it works really well with ranked choice voting, which, by the way, I am personally in favor of as well, and people in NPV are as well.
Connie McGrain asks, can you please explain in more detail how the block of states will vote their electoral votes by determining who wins the popular vote? Are the electoral votes split based on the popular vote in the state?
Okay, I'd love to explain that. So you have to think of it as 2 systems, and it's easiest to just forget how we currently do things. So you created a brand new system today. And what it says is everyone's going to vote, and every state is going to announce, just like they do on TV at the end of the evening or the next day, candidate A got this number of votes, candidate B this number, candidate C. And you do that in 50 states and the District of Columbia, and you create the total, and whoever wins the total, that's who's going to win the presidency. The states that opted into NPV, theirs is easy. They're just going to say, oh, that's who got the total, candidate B. So all of our 270 votes from all of these states go to candidate B. But what do we do with the other states who didn't opt in? Well, they're going to vote their electoral votes for who won their individual states. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, there are 30 states that opt into national popular vote, and they equal 300 electoral votes. And there are 20 states that didn't opt in. Well, those 20 states were going to vote for the Democrat or the Republican, depending on who won their state. But they're really going to have no impact on the end result because we already have 300 electoral votes committed. So take Florida, for example. If you live in Florida, right now, Florida has not opted in. We don't see it happening for 4 to 8 years. So when I vote in Florida, my vote counts for the nationwide total. So those 270 voting electoral states, or in my example, the states that equal 300 electoral votes, they're going to count my vote as part of the nationwide vote. And in Florida, the Florida Electoral College will use my vote to balance out how is Florida going to cast their electoral vote. So Florida will cast theirs for candidate C. Doesn't matter in the whole election. It just means when I go to visit elected officials in Florida and they say I'm not in favor of national popular vote, I usually say, now you know national popular vote is going to pass nationwide, even if it doesn't pass in Florida. And when it does, every vote of every voter in Florida will count to the nationwide total. And the electoral votes that Florida casts won't matter. That takes them a little moment to get used to the idea that their vote just won't matter at all. My vote will still matter as an individual. Everyone's vote will matter. But states that don't opt in, their vote doesn't really matter. Again, understand that those 270 electoral votes, or again, 300 in my example, they're not cast for a particular party. They're cast for the candidate that wins the most votes nationwide. And let me point out that the studies show that when states matter, so today we're talking swing states, but in the future we'll talk every state. When states matter and voters know the vote that they cast matters, the vote increases 7 to 10%. And then if you want to think, not just does that increase the nationwide total, but think of all the down ballot candidates. That increases their total and may change who your local county and state representatives are when more people come out to vote. Good
Great,
question.
you answered one of the questions while we were, you answered, that was a question in the chat. So there you go, that you answered that. Great. So Carol Brooksball asks, in Massachusetts, while we can call and write our legislators and urge them not to do away with NPV, what can we in Massachusetts do to get other states to come aboard?
That's a great question. So I am going to put in the chat now that website, nationalpopularvote.com. And you can contact them. They have a grassroots organization that meets once a month on Zoom across the country, talk about national popular vote. When there is actually activity like there was in Maine and then there was in Michigan, there were people that manned phone banks and did postcard writing. And so that was very useful, even if it wasn't in your state, for the states that were trying to pass it. And we do that all the time. In addition, there's a group of 5 league members from across the country who have just started a grassroots League of Women Voters network, so that we will do programs like I'm doing for you for every league in the country, because people may have heard of national popular vote, but they don't understand the intricacies, which are important to know. And so if you want to get in touch with them, I am going to put my email in the chat, and you can send me an email and I will forward it, because I don't know their website offhand. So, but you're welcome to send me an email as well. And send me an email if you'd like a presentation for a different group.
Oh, great, thank you. Do you, let's see, do you think this process would change the desire for specific parties to push restrictive voting laws?
I don't see why it would, but I guess the better answer is, did I just take myself off the screen? I'm sorry. I'll leave it up to Jen to fix it, or leave it the way it is. So the benefit of national popular vote is, as I said from the start, it's nonpartisan. So whether it helps a candidate of a party or another party, I love it because I think it'll end up with the best candidate. And I don't really care what party they're from, as long as they're a good candidate and their goals and policies are what I'm in tune with as well. Will people try to stop it? I think there are already people throughout the country trying to restrict who can vote and who can't vote. I don't know that NPV is going to motivate them any more or any less. But I know there's enough people on both sides of the aisle that are in favor of national popular vote. And we'll see. So Florida, as you probably know, is a Republican state. And 3 years ago, we had 3 co-sponsors on the national popular vote bill. And 2 sessions ago, we had 10 co-sponsors. Last session, we had 24 co-sponsors. And this session, we're hoping to have 30. And we're actually trying to entice some of the Republicans to join us as co-sponsors, which hasn't happened before. So we're optimistic. And I guess the trick is we're persistent. We're persistent and patient. We really think this is the way to go.
Let's see. Would this structure cause candidates to campaign only in states who have opted in and total the 270 electoral votes?
Okay, so think about it. Yes, the 270 are voting for the nationwide winner, but the nationwide winner is tallied from all 50 states in the District of Columbia. So they can't afford to leave people out. What it will do, in my view, is it'll bring candidates closer to the middle. So I'm not saying they're going to be on the fence centrists, but they're not going to be at the extremes, because it will be like the old days when there are crossover voters. You may like a candidate even if he's from a different party or she's from a different party. That doesn't happen generally when you have the extremes. So you can't just campaign in the states that have 270, because then that leaves the other states that have 268 electoral votes. It leaves a lot of people, it leaves a lot of votes on the table. No, you have to campaign in every state to every voter. It takes the entire United States and it turns it into a swing state. That's as simple as it gets. Think about this. I'm going to answer it one more way. Again, unlike what we're used to today, the way people campaign, think about how Pepsi runs their business. If there's a district that has 70% Coca-Cola drinkers, that means 30% might still be enticed to Pepsi, and some of that 70% might come over to Pepsi. Pepsi doesn't stop campaigning in a district just because Coca-Cola is the primary candidate. Candidates will campaign everywhere because every vote matters. Any others, Jen? Anybody want to raise their hand?
Sure. Would anyone like to come off mute, raise your hand using the raise hand feature and come off mute and ask your question?
Very shy.
This is not a shy group. We love, so Mary. I'll ask to unmute you. There we go.
Thank you.
There we go.
taking my question. I wonder, I've heard people say that the two-party system is just, not fair. We should have more parties. Do you see this in any way facilitating more candidates, more parties, beyond the traditional?
That's a complicated question in that most states are run by the two major political parties and the primary systems are run by them. And so in order to get on ballots, there are restrictions and it makes it difficult. I think that could loosen up. To be honest, that's far beyond what I get involved in. So I don't really know. I don't predict how that will change. What I do know is even with the two-party system, we will have better candidates. It's a little bit like changing the primary system. So in Florida, we have a closed primary. Democratic enrolled people can only vote for Democrats. Republican enrolled can only vote for Republicans in the primary. Independents, only independents, and no party affiliation, which is about a third of all of our voters, cannot vote in the primary. So I think when you start to do things like open primaries, who the candidates who win in the primaries change, and that's who changes who your candidates are in the general election. So I think there are lots of other things that could change. I don't know if NPV is going to affect that at all.
I see. Thank you. That makes sense.
Margaret? Make sure you're unmuted.
First, I just want to say excellent presentation. That was one. And then I know there have been some concerns about the constitutionality of the NPVIC. And then there have been some people who have been concerned about that, who have said with one successful use of the NVPIC, in other words, one presidential election, that it might be the impetus for people to jump on board with the constitutional amendment that Birch Bayh tried to pass many, many years ago. I'm curious how first, if you have any thoughts about the constitutionality, and secondly, is it too much to be looking down the road at a potential constitutional amendment? Do you think that will scare people away?
Two great questions. So let me start with the first is this interstate compact constitutional? So what the Supreme Court has said over and over again, as recently as 4 years ago, 5 years ago, very recent, interstate compacts that do not take away federal authority are permitted. So if we try to create an interstate compact that took over defense of the state from the armed forces, that would be unconstitutional. But this does just what the Constitution says. It says every state can choose how they award their electors. And that's what we're doing. We're changing to say we are going to award our electors based on the national popular vote. Now, it doesn't go into effect until there are states equaling 270. But what if tomorrow Virginia passes a law that says we're not waiting? We're going to cast our electors for the nationwide winner. Now, there's no guarantee that those votes will matter. They could be on the different side than the winner, but they don't have to wait. In this system, what we're saying to states is, now we don't want you to do it until it will matter, till it will count. But as a state, you have the right to do that. The Supreme Court has upheld that right time and again. Now, could the Supreme Court ignore stare decisis? Could they ignore what's been the rule of law for 200 years? They could, but even with this Supreme Court, I don't really see that as likely. Will there be a constitutional challenge? Yes, of course. A constitutional challenge is to everything. So I don't see that happening. The second question was, I forget, just prompt me again.
Yeah, no, I'm just concerned about even discussing the possibility that that a
Oh,
successful
yes, thank you, thank you. So,
constitutional amendment.
so we in National Popular Vote don't like the idea of pushing a constitutional amendment because we don't think it's going to happen. And why are we wasting our time? We do think NPV could happen, and we agree with what you inferred is that once NPV comes on the stage and people see the sky isn't falling and actually their vote matters, I think there'll be less and less hostility towards it. I think there'll be more people that say, well, if it works so well, why do we need an electoral college? Why don't we just use the national popular vote? So yes, I think once it's in place, it will expedite a constitutional amendment that could pass. Yep.
Great. Well, Dan, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. We really appreciate your time and talent and energy and persistence, as you mentioned. So on behalf of all of us at League of Women Voters of Massachusetts, thank you so much. And we look forward to hearing more from you. So thank you.
Thank
and
you,
good
Jen.
night.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate you being here.
Thank you. Take care.